contestations, I specifically focus on the debates, the disagreements regarding how the armed struggle is remembered. So the aspect of complexities that I explore in this study revolves around the contested narratives surrounding the archiving of this heritage, including the archival silences, politics in archiving liberation struggle collections, including ownership, the custody issue, and access concerns. So as a background to the study, we find that Zimbabwe was known as Rhodesia during the colonial times, and it was involved in an armed struggle from 1964 to 1979 when ceasefire was reached, ultimately leading to independence in 1980. So during this period of the liberation struggle, the former nationalist movements created records of archival value. And several scholars have alluded to the fact that documentation generated in armed conflicts provides a critical understanding of the events of the war as the war unfolds. Therefore, we find that liberation struggle documentation makes a vital contribution to the history of Zimbabwe. So in that line, we find that there have been several projects that have been geared towards the preservation of this heritage. And largely, this heritage has not just been looked at as just private collections, but it has been looked at as national heritage of importance throughout Africa, in those countries that were involved in armed struggles. So in the African continental level, we've had projects such as the Aluka project, which was a project specifically aimed at digitizing liberation struggle collections in Southern Africa, followed by the Hashimbita project in 2005. Then there was also a key survey, which was done by UNESCO and SADC, which was a survey of 9 African countries in Southern Africa, also aimed at looking at ways to preserve and manage liberation struggle archives. So at the local national level, we've also had projects spearheaded by the National Archives of Zimbabwe, abbreviated as NAZ. Other projects also have been done in collaboration with the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, abbreviated as NMMZ. Then currently underway is the construction of the Museum of African Liberation in Zimbabwe. Then still as part of the background, we find that amidst these initiatives to archive and preserve liberation struggle heritage, there have also been calls from the government, war veterans, and other heritage institutions for liberation struggle heritage to be preserved for future generations. So as you can see on the slide, I show a picture of the vice president who was captured in one of the local newspapers in 2024. So he was recorded as encouraging war veterans to document their war history. Then apart from such calls, so what gap does the study seek to fill? Specifically, we find that loss of war archives, silences, and archival gaps remain under-examined, including the archivist's choices and decisions in constructing archival collections. Then again, we also find that in most researches that have been done around liberation struggle heritage, most historians and scholars would just stop at acknowledging the scarcity of these archival materials without really going further to probe into the reasons and understand the nature of this scarcity. Why is it that these archives of the nationalist movements are scarce and not inaccessible? So that's where my research then comes in, to try to probe into this scarcity, the silences and inaccessibility of liberation struggle archives. So my motivation was specifically to focus on archival collections of the liberation struggle, specifically those that are locally held in Zimbabwe, not migrated archives, because a lot of scholarship has been directed to looking at migrated archives in Africa and so forth. but my focus specifically was looking at these collections that are locally held in the country, liberation struggle collections, which brings us to the problem under study. So recent evidence has largely shown that primary source archives of most liberation movements in Africa are largely inaccessible to researchers. So this also applies to the archives created by the former nationalist movements in Zimbabwe, such as ZANU and ZAPU, where we find that in Zimbabwe, there's a dearth of documentation on the participation of the former nationalist movements in the liberation struggle. So as a result, we find that primary source materials of the liberation struggle remain silenced, they are inaccessible, and ultimately exposed to a risk of loss. So the lack of sustained efforts to systematically preserve these archival materials more than 44 years after independence has remained a concern. Consequently, these archives will be unavailable to future generations. So the study therefore investigates these archival silences and the lack of accessibility of these archives, leading us to the purpose of the study. So the study explored the complex nature and silences that impact the archiving of liberation struggle heritage of the nationalist movements in Zimbabwe from 1961 to 2024. So with the specific objective aiming to first examine contestations over the memory and history of the liberation struggle from 1961 to 2024, the second objective aimed to assess the nature of war archives and consult archival evidence of the liberation struggle from 1964 when the war started to 2024. The third objective sought to analyze the politics of archiving armed struggle collections at the National Archives of Zimbabwe post-independence, that is from 1980 to 2024. Then the last objective of the study sought to examine custody and access to liberation struggle archives from 1980 to 2024. So why does the study start in 1961? 1961 actually comes in as a key moment in the history of the armed struggle, where we see that earlier in 1960, the National Democratic Party had been formed to wage a war against the Smith regime. In 1961, this National Democratic Party is banned, leading to the formation of ZAPU. So this was a period that marked intensified efforts to wage a war against the Smith regime. Then the study stops at 2024 because 2024 also that's where we see government efforts, interests to preserve and protect liberation struggle heritage, where in February 2024, the Southern African Development Community signed an MOU with the Museum of African Liberation to support the construction of this Liberation Museum in Zimbabwe. Geographically, the study was done in the Bulawayo and Harare provinces of Zimbabwe. Conceptually, this is an interdisciplinary study which brings together the fields of archival science and history. So in this study, I specifically look at archives as the object of study, not only as merely a source of historical information. I also explore the concept of archival silences and silences in historical production as interpreted by Trollope 95, who traces 4 moments in silencing history from the moment of creating the sources to archives assembled to the moment of fact retrieval and ultimately to the final making of history. So in this research, I adopted 3 theories, mainly the post-colonial theory, critical archival praxis, and the post-custodial theory. So post-colonial theory actually provides a theoretical base for post-colonial archival studies, which with core tenets which focus on looking at colonial histories, the impacts on contemporary societies, power structures, power dynamics, concerns about representation and self-representation. So in terms of application in this study, post-colonial theory actually helped in providing the lens to examine the ongoing colonial legacies of archiving this liberation struggle heritage, including the power inequalities that we see in different spaces where this heritage is residing. Furthermore, this theory are also assisted in the investigation of silences and representation or lack of representation of these collections, of these armed struggle collections. Because post-colonial theory is wide in its focus, we find that it does not really provide us with an understanding of the impacts of colonialism on collective memory of the armed struggle. So as a result, I had to invoke the critical archival praxis, which is derived from critical theory. So specifically, critical archival praxis was propounded by Michelle Caswell, and it aims to explain the status quo within society in terms of what is an anomaly or deviation from the norm. It also has a focus on presenting practical ways to transform society. So how did I apply this to the study? So using the critical archival praxis, it allowed the research to trace the dynamics of post-colonialism in archiving these collections, to also critique the uneven distribution of power when it comes to archiving these collections, to explore contestations and critique the politics that are involved in archiving liberation struggle heritage. So because the critical archival praxis stops at just providing us with a critique, so I also had to invoke the post-custodial theory, a theory that would allow for an in-depth investigation into custody, ownership, and access to these liberation struggle collections. So I also had to adopt the post-custodial theory propounded by Gerald Ham. So the focus of this theory aims to liberate archives from a focus on physical and legal custody. So the main aim is to decentralize archival systems. So unlike the traditional archival, or unlike the traditional custodial formations that we find in archival spaces, where only archives would be recognized to be archival, after they cross into the archival threshold, the post-custodial theory comes in to propose that records have to remain close to their point of creation. So in applying this theory to the study, it allowed for an interrogation into custody issues, the ownership and access to armed struggle collections. Then moving on to methodology, this study adopted a historical multiple case study design following a historical approach in interrogating the archiving of liberation struggle heritage in Zimbabwe. So multiple cases were mainly drawn from the different heritage institutions that participated in this research, institutions such as the National Archives of Zimbabwe and the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, and the Museum of African Liberation. Then other cases also came from institutions owned and controlled by the former nationalist movements. Then the approach adopted was qualitative, with archival methods used, document analysis, observation analysis, and interviews. So the population mainly consisted of archivists, museum curators, and war veterans. So for those who were purposively sampling, it was key participants with relevant information and expertise to probe more light into the archiving of this liberation struggle heritage of the former nationalist movements. Then snowball sampling was mainly applied to the war veterans because they proved to be a difficult group to reach out to. So through snowball sampling, through referrals, the researcher was able to reach out to the different war veterans. So data analysis was mainly thematic, where initially the key codes were derived from the data, sorted into themes. So the analysis and interpretation was mainly guided by the key themes derived from the data. Ethical clearance was also sought from the various institutions that participated in this research, such as the Joshua Mkabugo Foundation, the Museum of African Liberation, amongst others. Then my research findings are organized according to the objectives of the study, where the first objective sought to examine contestations around the history and memory of the armed struggle from 1961 to 2024. So as alluded to earlier, 1961 becomes a key period in the history of the armed struggle, where we see ZAPU as one of the main nationalist movements being formed. So once these nationalist movements were formed, the Rhodesian government was quick to ban them. So just before ZAPU was banned, the ZAPU Central Committee set and agreed that no other nationalist movement would be formed to replace ZAPU. So the reason for this was to keep the momentum for an armed struggle going so that people don't lose hope in these nationalist movements. So in 1962, when ZAPU is banned, in the following year, we see the emergence of ZANU as another nationalist movement. So there were actually certain individuals in ZAPU who were not happy with the leadership. Individuals like Edgar Tekere, Robert Mugabe, and Ndabaningi Stole, these are the key individuals who went on to form ZANU in 1963, resulting in the ZAPU-ZANU split. So the split was due to differences in ideology, in terms of approaching the armed struggle, differences in tactics, and so forth. So as a way of trying to unite these two nationalist movements, later organizations, the Organization of African Union, including some of the frontline states, actually tried to find ways of uniting these two nationalist movements so that they could fight as a united force. So in 1971, we see the Front for the Liberation of Zimbabwe coming up, flourishing, but it's also a short-lived organization which does not live to achieve the objective of uniting these nationalist movements. In 1975, the Zimbabwe People's Army is also formed to try to unite these nationalist movements, but it's also short-lived. They also tried to come together under a patriotic front in 1976, and this also is short-lived because we see these two nationalist movements approaching elections in 1980 as two separate political parties. So these resultant relationships and developments that emerged from these formations led to these complexities that then we see post-independence in terms of trying to archive this heritage. Because post-independence or its independence in 1980, patriotic history starts to emerge, where scholars such as Terence Ranger describe it as a monolithic narrative, which comes from the victor, where the victor actually advances their historical accounts in terms of how the events of the war took place. So largely the government has controlled memorialization efforts in the country. In 1987, despite the Unity Accord being signed to bring together these nationalist movements post-independence, this Unity Accord also does not succeed in its intent because still we do not see a balanced approach to archiving. So largely the study findings reveal that heritage institutions such as the National Archives of Zimbabwe and the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe have been turned into tools of government, largely state-controlled. Even memorialization efforts are state-controlled. Then in 2024, there was the emergence of the Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology, which was constructed in honor of one of the late key nationalist movements, Herbert Chitepo. So in interviews with a representative from the Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology, it emerged that this is a key institution that is at the forefront of inculcating patriotic history in the country. Ultimately, findings of the study under this objective reveal that the history of the armed struggle has and continues to be written and narrated from different perspectives. As we are going to see in the next slide, here I show a picture of a war veteran, Comrade Linda Mangwente, who holds the poster with her portrait bearing Vice President Joyce Mjuru's name. So this was a newspaper article which came out in a government newspaper, The Herald. And it carried a story where the former Vice President Joyce Mjuru was said to have stolen a picture of a former war veteran. So the story revolves around the fact that in 2004, when Joyce Mjuru was elected as vice president, it was the time when Robert Mugabe was president in Zimbabwe. So during that time, she perpetuated a narrative that she had single-handedly shot down a Rhodesian helicopter. So during that time, this was taken to be the truth, to be the true account of events as they happened. But in 2014, once she stepped down and was removed from government, the same government started discrediting her to say that never happened. That was a lie. Hence, we see the story in this newspaper. So therefore, these are some of the contestations that come when we look at the archiving of this heritage. And the main argument that the study also advances is that without the primary source archival materials of the former nationalist movements and the former guerrillas, these distortions and contestations will continue. Then moving on to the second objective, which focused on the nature of these archives and the concealment of archival evidence. So here I traced the viewpoints of the nationalist movements and traced how the nature of these materials, how they've been archived. So we find that in 1964, when the war started, the two main nationalist movements, as I said earlier, they created records of national significance during the armed struggle. So in an interview with the ZANU-PF archivist, he stated that during the struggle, they used a system codenamed 3 checkups. So in this slide, I show a form actually capturing how these 3 checkups were constituted. So these forms, they captured details of the young men and the young women as they joined the struggle. So it was basically personal details of the recruitees, where they would capture the date name, the Chimurenga name, which was a pseudonym that was given to these recruitees as they joined the struggle. So this was a way of creating archival records on the ZANU side. Then on the side of ZAPU and ZIPRA, in interviews, they also stated that they created a lot of archival records at individual and departmental levels. So we see that this armed struggle was largely fought outside Zimbabwe, in countries that supported these nationalist movements, countries such as Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and so forth. So after the war ended, it was expected that they would repatriate whatever archival materials they had created outside the country. However, these repatriation efforts proved to be unplanned, as findings of the study show. Unlike repatriation efforts that were done by other countries such as South Africa, because for South Africa, it's highly documented by scholars such as Vavusile Maba that they had an archival institution for the African National Congress in Tanzania. When independence came, they moved their materials from Tanzania back into South Africa to a building owned by the ANC, which was the Shell building. After some screening of the materials, they then transferred those materials to the University of Fort Hare. However, when we trace repatriation efforts for Zimbabwe immediately after independence in 1982, instead of properly archiving and preserving these materials, the ZANU-PF government takes away the ZIPRA archives. So in this study, I argue that this was the first phase in public act of silencing the armed struggle archives. Then further to that, later in 1982, a group of North Korean trained soldiers named the 5th Brigade were sent to the Matabeleland and Midlands regions of the country, and they mainly targeted the ZAPU and ZIPRA veterans, where scholars such as Gacheni state that more than 20,000 people were killed. So the targeted dissidents or bandits during this time found ways of concealing any incriminating materials and documents linking them to ZAPU or ZIPRA. In one of the interviews, one of the war veterans stated, and I quote, "When Kubraundi came, I put some material and a lot of books written by Karl Marx in my car and went to the village where I took my sister's metal trunk and put all my military items, including documents and boots. I dug a shallow pit and buried the materials about 1.5 meters underground. I had to drill a small hole and insert a pipe for air circulation. When the rains came, I, however, suspect that a cow hit the pipe and it fell. After 1987, when I dug up the trunk, everything inside was rotten." So this is one of the examples in which more archival materials were lost after some were taken away by the government, when this Gugraundi came, more archival material also was lost in such incidences. Therefore, in this study, I identify this Gugraundi period as the second phase in public act of silencing the armed struggle archives. Then the third objective actually looked at the politics of collection building at the National Archives of Zimbabwe post-independence. So the mandate of the National Archives of Zimbabwe is to preserve and store public records and public archives. However, when it comes to liberation struggle collections, there are complexities at the National Archives of Zimbabwe in terms of archiving this heritage, whereby findings of the study revealed that 90% of the collections remain colonial. There's politics in collection building, whereby the biases that come in with the archivists shape what is ultimately included and excluded in collections. Findings of the study further revealed that the main legislative instrument, the National Archives of Zimbabwe Act of 1986, remains largely outdated and unclear on the specific records the archival institution is supposed to bring under its custody. Ultimately, this weakens the powers of the National Archives. So interview data and document analysis conducted revealed the depleted state of collections at the National Archives of Zimbabwe. So what compounds the situation is also the element of mistrust in the National Archival Institution, whereby in one of the interviews with one of the archivists, they stated, and I quote, "We have made efforts. The late director once visited the ZANU-PF headquarters just before the COVID lockdown to convince them to deposit with the National Archives of Zimbabwe, but it did not work." So resultantly, we find that the ZANU-PF as a political organization has kept their ZANLA archives more than 44 years after independence without releasing them to the NAS. Study findings also show that even for the ZIPRA archives, they have not been deposited to the National Archives of Zimbabwe, including individual war veteran archives. As a way of trying to fill in gaps in archival collections, the National Archives has embarked on oral history projects to reach out to various war veterans across the country. But these oral history projects also have been met with challenges as revealed by the study findings, challenges about being under-resourced, under-equipped, understaffed, and so forth. So this then further affects the archiving of these liberation struggle archives. So the last objective of the study then therefore went outside the National Archives to then look at what the nationalist movements, the former nationalist movements are doing, families and war veterans. Further to that, I also reviewed the Constitution of Zimbabwe to understand issues around custody ownership and access to liberation struggle archives. So a review of the Constitution of Zimbabwe Act of 2013 and the Freedom of Information Act actually show that these legislative instruments support access or promote access to information by citizens of Zimbabwe. Even the Freedom of Information Act in Section 27 actually quotes that for military information more than 20 years old, it has to be publicly accessible. However, we find that liberation struggle archives, which were created more than 44 years after independence, are still not publicly accessible. So further to these two legislative acts, I also reviewed the Copyright and Neighboring Rights Act of 2004, which seeks or focuses on the protection of ownership rights of intellectual and other works. So we find that during the armed struggle, the liberation movements, the guerrillas could have created musical works, other intellectual works, which may be protected under the Copyright and Neighboring Rights Act. But this study argues that there is a need to balance the protection of ownership rights with the need to provide access to these archives. And further findings also reveal that despite the construction of the Museum of African Liberation, which is underway in Zimbabwe, neither the ZANU nor the ZAPU have deposited part of their collections with this museum. So in an interview with the ZANU-PF archivists in a bid to try to understand the lack of accessibility of their collections, he stated, and I quote, most of our collections are confidential, very confidential. We have records of military operations. We cannot have the public accessing them. We don't know what people may do with that information. Any day we may see this information all over the media or published somewhere. People can go to the National Archives of Zimbabwe. All of our things are there. Our information is sensitive. People cannot access it. This is our information. So such sentiments actually from a key custodian of the Zanla archives actually reveals how they feel towards these materials, that these materials should not be accessed by the public, but should be kept in spaces where people cannot see them. And again, there's a contradiction that was raised where they would claim that these materials are with the National Archives of Zimbabwe. But research at the National Archives of Zimbabwe shows that the NAS does not hold these collections of the former nationalist movements. So still under these objectives, further findings revealed that family archives make a crucial contribution to the heritage of the armed struggle, where families of prominent nationalist movements such as Joshua Nkomo have gone on to establish the Joshua Mkabo Nkomo Museum. The family of Herbert Chitepo during data collection was also in contact with the National Archives of Zimbabwe to try and also create the Herbert Chitepo Museum. Then the family of George Slundika was also making attempts to create a museum to archive the liberation struggle heritage of the former nationalist leader. However, study findings reveal that family members of less well-known figures tend to be unaware of the archival value of these liberation struggle materials once the war veteran has died. Ultimately, we find that this material is easily disposed. The study findings also revealed that family members of more prominent former nationalist leaders would tend to prioritize the archival materials and organize resources for their preservation. Ultimately, study findings reveal that liberation struggle archives remain at a high risk of loss despite initiatives by the various stakeholders to try to archive and salvage this material. So in conclusion, I reflect on the complex nature of archiving this heritage to say this heritage becomes complex and in the sense that it's largely contested. So it's contested heritage which is distorted and controlled by the state. So I also conclude that because of post-independence suspicion and mistrust, where we see the seizure of the Zipra archives, the Gugrawundi also coming in, this largely complicates the archiving of this heritage. The study further concludes that because of mistrust in the archival system, the National Archives of Zimbabwe has largely failed to archive this heritage. So we also see the complex custody and ownership question, whereby there are also acts of silencing and concealing the archives instead of making them publicly accessible. So all these issues complicate the archiving of this heritage. Therefore, without archives, the societal memory of the liberation struggle remains impaired. Consequently, the archiving of liberation struggle heritage in Zimbabwe, it continues at an indeterminate state more than 44 years after independence. So I therefore recommend the need to negotiate access conditions to armed struggle collections, which are held by different stakeholders in Zimbabwe. I also recommend for the release of war archives to foster transitional justice processes in Zimbabwe. And this has to start with the release of the Zipra archives that were taken away. If those archives are still there, followed by making the Zanla archives publicly accessible. Then the study further recommends that the NAS has to decolonize liberation struggle collections. And this has to begin with formal recognition, inclusion, and preservation of the heritage status of these archives that are with various stakeholders. There's ultimately the need to reconcile and address the different ownership, management, and custodial paradigms that currently exist regarding these archives of the former nationalist movements. So this study therefore makes important disciplinary contributions to archival studies and history due to its interdisciplinary nature. The study further makes archival theory contributions as it provides a nuanced interpretation of archiving liberation struggle heritage, focusing on the politics, the silences, and contestations. Further contributions are made by this study because it creates awareness on the importance of armed struggle archives, not only as private collections, but as national heritage of the liberation struggle. So finally, the study makes policy contributions towards the revision of key legislative instruments such as the National Archives of Zimbabwe Act and the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe Act. So in terms of areas of further research can focus on migrated archives that were taken out of the country, those archives that reside in different countries such as Britain, then maybe migrated archives which were left in the Nordic countries, which also helped the former nationalist movements and so forth. Then further research can also focus on digitization efforts, specifically on strategies to effectively digitize these collections of the former nationalist movements. And ultimately, further research can focus on accounts of Zanla veterans and their individual or family-held archives. And the same can also be done for the ZAPU ZIPRA archives. So these are the manuscripts that I have. Two of them are under publication by the Esabica Journal and the Journal of Society of and by the Journal of South African Society of Archivists. Then another manuscript is under review under the Journal of Collection Management. I thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Hitha. I think let's clap for her again. She's, you've taken us through your very rich study. And I hope you have some water, tea with you. You can sip a little bit. Yes. As we wait for this moment of critical engagement. So, yes. Okay. So I wanted to be sure what Farouk decides. But he's guided. So it's now my singular honor to invite Dr. Mwine to come and engage the candidate.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning, Dr. Mwine.
I was hoping you'd be here, but I'm glad our network has been stable thus far, and congratulations on the work that you have shared with us. I will be in a conversation with you. You've done quite a lot of presentation already, sharing with us the insights from your work. So I would like that we walk this journey together through your thesis. There are a few things that we will have to reflect on together, and this is really to learn from you and appreciate the entire process of research and the knowledge that you bring in archives and history. I'm called Amon Mwine. I'm not an archivist. I am not a historian either. I am a scholar learning from both of those fields. I enter into the work of history and archives as a researcher, recently in Makerere University, looking at archiving method and memory in which my central focus then was on community archives in Uganda. And I was privileged to meet you in some of the seminars here and some of the people in History and Archives department. And I've really found your work very interesting. But I also come from gender studies, particularly critical studies of men and masculinities. And so you're likely to find some points of engagement emerging from that context. I really found this work very interesting, good to read. I enjoyed it, and I also find it timely, especially as it aims to recall and remember experiences of a national struggle of that nature. Of course, recently we've been looking at Global South communities demanding for the return of material migrated to the colonizers' governments. And now here we look at you demanding for the archiving of memory constituted on our own soil. And you do argue that the documentation of nationalist movements that invested into the struggle for independence forms a crucial part of the country's collective memory and national identity, which I find very interesting. And I do look at this study as one that stands at the intersection of two fields, but closely related, archival science and history, to recall past experience of Zimbabwean national liberation struggles, particularly as you interrogate these memories, the way they were recorded, preserved, and how they are made accessible or how they are denied, they are closed from the public. Your interrogation of archives as products of complex power relations is very interesting. Importantly, how these are silenced and closed off from the public. While justifying the work of archives, you do argue that without archives, memory falters and knowledge of accomplishment fades and pride in shared past dissipates. And so you want to look at archives and how they shape collective memory and contribute to national identity. I find your work equally coming off in some ways as about refiguring the archive. I've met scholarship in archival studies looking at how the archive, every archive is figured in the sense that it is shaped and constructed and mediated by choices and perspectives and power relations, implying that archives then require transformation or refiguring. I do hope that you can take us through how your work then commits to that transformative call. You have also demonstrated how the archive is contested, how it is reshaped by politics of the day in Zimbabwe. You have exposed its temporal nature. You've looked in particular on the idea that the archive is always in the process of becoming. It seems the archive is never a finished entity. If there is anything, if there is something you have ably illustrated as I read through, is what Derrida asserts, that the archive indeed, that there is no political power without control of the archive, because I see a lot of contest between the nationalist movements in terms of who takes control of this archive and therefore dictates what the movement, what the liberation was. So this is really quite interesting work. I really enjoyed reading through. I wanted to learn from you from the very beginning who Ndlovu is? Who are you?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mwine, for that. So as I approach this research, I approach it first and foremost as a researcher, but with a background in records and archives management. I teach records and archives management in one of the universities in Zimbabwe. So that's what I can say for now.
Okay. So are you a historian? Are you an archivist? How do you locate yourself?
Okay, I fuse both. I approach as an archivist and I approach the study as a historian.
Okay. Do you, in a way, find that position reflected in your dissertation? Do you reflect on those biographical sources that might enable us understand why you were writing the way you were writing?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes, largely I reflect on both because the takeoff actually in doing this research, for us to understand these archives, we cannot understand the archiving and the complications, the complex nature without taking a step back into the history. So the fusing of the two had to come into the research. The history has to be understood for us to then appreciate how the archiving of this heritage has evolved post-independence.
Yeah, so Heather, where in the dissertation do you share with us your positionality?
In the research, I'm not explicit about the positionality because why? I thought my positionality really does not come in with obvious biases where we can say as an archivist, then the research gets biased in this way or that way. So that's how I saw it. But in my chapter 3, there's a section where I try and talk about one of the veterans trusts, the Zipra Veterans Trust, how they were largely involved in tracing their history, which also sort of motivated the need for this study. But ultimately, I'm not explicit about that positionality.
Your positionality, so is that a choice you had to take? That your identity should not feature anywhere because of any reason?
Thank you for that. Maybe to approach, actually, as a way of approaching the research objectively,
Yeah.
yes, I saw it fit that instead of advancing my positionality, I have to advance the story of archiving this heritage.
Yeah, I think you might need to reflect and think deep about that question. Because you come into this study with a certain position, which comes into the writing ultimately. And so not declaring it might be, doing a disservice to yourself, but also to the reader who is looking through these. And really doing that may not necessarily be that you're going to bias. You could also benefit from the kind of richness of knowledge and experience that you come with, that you want really to spring from as you approach this study. So I haven't seen it, and you do admit that you did not engage with it. So whether you engage with it or you don't engage with it, you need to be explicit about it in this study. You are also here. You stayed in Uganda for some time. How long? How long were you here?
when we started the PhD program, I was in Uganda from January to August 2023. Then that's when I then left for data collection. So the greater part of 2024, I was back in Zimbabwe doing data collection.
Okay. So in your stay, because even if you stayed in Zimbabwe, you would have come to know anyway. Uganda shares a closely similar history of liberation struggle. Similar around the same time, 1981, 1986. Did you encounter any of that history in your writing? Did it in any way influence the way you think about things?
Largely the focus of the writing was on liberation struggle history from a Southern African perspective.
Yeah. And it didn't matter whether liberation struggles happen anywhere else and whether you could reflect on it.
Not that they do not matter, because in my chapter 2, where I really trace the history of the nationalist movements, I take a broader perspective to appreciate the various contexts in which these former nationalist movements are formed in the various countries where we've had nationalist movements. So the other contexts are largely captured in chapter 2, where I do the extensive review.
Yeah. So yeah, because Uganda went through the same, and you were here and had the beauty of standing on the grounds where that revolution happened. I thought there could be a few lessons that you could have picked as we go along. For example, we will engage with the question of gender in the liberation movement, which was very topical in Uganda's history, which I thought you could have also learned from, but we will reach at that level and reflect on that. So when you look at your first chapter, what does it offer to us as a reader? Just 1 or 2 minutes. What does the chapter bring to us?
Thank you for the question. In chapter 1, I present the background to the study, where I trace the history of the war. I also give an overview of documenting liberation struggle history in Zimbabwe, the various initiatives that have been done. I also engage with the significance and justification of the study to really bring out the gap, to say, despite these other studies that have been done, to try to look into the liberation struggle, where are the gaps and how I come in. So I think I also narrated in my presentation that would find that most historical studies on the liberation struggle would just appreciate the scarcity of sources, then immediately move to alternative sources of information. But in this study, then I go on to explore this scarcity, these gaps, to understand specifically in terms of archiving what is happening. So those are the issues that I bring out in the first chapter, including the theories.
Yes. You also trace archival system in Zimbabwe through what you term formal archival systems. This then leads you to locate colonial era as the beginning of your engagement with the work on the archive. But within the chapter, you also reflect, at the same time you reflect on efforts of the indigenous communities who drew from their culture and religious belief systems to mount resistance to colonial rule. What you reflect on as the first Chimlenga Rebellion, 1896-97. I just wanted to learn from you, what was the choice of your beginning? Why did you begin from a colonial period in terms of timing?
Okay. Thank you for that question. It was actually to try to frame the liberation struggle that we see beginning later, because when we trace the history of the war in Zimbabwe, we find that initially there was the first Chimurenga, the earlier wars, where I link with the colonial times. So bringing the first Chimurenga into perspective was meant to show that the struggle for African land, African rights over colonial rule, so that has a history that is traced back into the first Chimurenga, because the period that I focus on, 1961, is where now we start to see efforts by the nationalist movements, the second Chimurenga now starting.
Okay. And of course, you also have a theme on decolonization. Because I was trying to look at that takeoff point for somebody who's also interested in the conversation on decolonization. What exactly do we lose when we start theorizing and conceptualizing at that point of knowledge? When we begin with the colonial experience as the beginning point, is there anything we lose?
Maybe if you could clarify, I'm not really getting the question.
I'm looking at communities in Zimbabwe, and perhaps they could have had their own way of generating knowledge, preserving, and passing on these memories from one generation to another.
Mm.
And so they could be one of the, you could have chosen to start from how did the people in Zimbabwe, before we talk of colonialists, how did they conceive archiving? And how did they archive? But you chose to start with colonialism and how the archive is perceived from that point of knowledge. So I'm looking at your choice of takeoff and thinking, is there anything of value that you could have gained if you had a different point of takeoff?
Thank you, Dr. Mwine, for that question. It's much clearer now. So in response to that, I would say that in terms of beginning the study, specifically the focus was on these nationalist movements. So now taking the study way much back before even the colonialists came to trace their ways of living, whether they archived the indigenous ways of doing things. I saw it that it would broaden the scope so much that it would even at some point derail our focus, because the focus was on these former nationalist movements, to say when we speak of the nationalist movements in the different countries in Africa, what was their aim? And for Zimbabwe, we trace this back to the time to 1890, where we see the British South Africa Company coming in, the British pioneer coming in to occupy the place during that time, as it was known as Rhodesia. So that was a time really when the uprisings started, like I said, with the first Chimurenga coming in and the spirit mediums also coming in to help the people who were at the forefront of fighting these colonialists. So I thought if the timing started from there, then it actually centers around the time of the uprisings, where it then lays the foundation for later on the second Chimurenga that we see in the early 1960s leading to independence. So that is basically what guided the timing of when the study would start.
Did you miss anything? Because later you also talk about, as you talk about the, I think at around page 165, you look at, you show a photo showing the use of spirit mediums to support security forces at the meetings. And I thought maybe this could be something that strongly comes from the history that you have not engaged with. So that is why I was asking, did we miss anything by not prioritizing, reflection on pre-colonial ways of archiving and engaging with memory. Just to see if there is anything that you think you could have missed.
For now, my response would be no. Also based on the fact that what I later show in chapter 6, it was centered around photographic collections at the National Archives of Zimbabwe, which would capture that period of the first Chimurenga going into the War of Liberation. So I believe that by capturing that period of the first Chimurenga, in the background of the study in chapter 1, I actually also explicitly state the role of those spirit mediums and how they would come in to help in the revolt that was taking place against the colonialists. So for now, I believe that that approach could have been sufficient, but I stand guided.
Okay. You define liberation heritage as a way of making clear what your focus is and what is it that you're going to focus on. Section 1.2.2, around page 9, you indicate that for purposes of this study, the phrase liberation struggle heritage is adopted from an archival perspective to mean recorded documentary heritage, such as documents, audiovisual collections, photographs, and oral histories. Slightly before this, you share a much more broader scope of understanding heritage as guided by Taruvinga and Domingos on page 8 to include music, graves, detention centers, poetry, refugee camps, meetings, etc., which looked like it was much more broad and encompassing, but you said for purposes of this study you're focusing on the other. In your presentation, I saw something around things that you promised you are not going to focus on, but also the question before your presentation was, why did you choose to seemingly narrow the focus on, documentary? And then there are many other things in the previous description of what heritage is. So why did you make that choice?
Thank you for the question. So as I said from my presentation, that this study was done purely from an archival studies perspective. So in archival science, when we look at documentary heritage, we're looking at recorded heritage. It can be recorded in various forms, such as audiovisual, such as in paper formats, in various formats. But this definition that is presented by Taruvinga and Domingos, where the definition of liberation heritage will go on to include graves, sites where battles were fought, and meeting places, falls actually outside of the scope of the study, because specifically for this study, from an archival perspective, I was focusing on the recorded documentary heritage that these former nationalist movements created, to zero on to those aspects. Then from a broader museum perspective, there's usually the tendency to broaden the liberation struggle heritage to include all these other forms of heritage, even the rocks, the graves, and all those aspects. So for my study, I demarcated the scope just to focus on the recorded documentary heritage that these former nationalist movements created, to understand how these specific archives have been preserved and safeguarded against loss.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's reflect on on theory, which you offer a greater detail in your presentation just a few minutes ago. But I just wanted to hear it from you now. What theories informed your study? Because unlike in the presentation, in the book, as a reader, I didn't get to know what theory are you working with and which theorist is behind that theory.
Okay.
The same feeling that you were much more clearer in the presentation here than you were in the book?
Thank you, Doctor, for that. In the book, I also explicitly state that the study is guided by three theories: the post-colonial theory, the critical archival praxis that is adopted from critical theory, and the post-custodial theory. So I also focus on the breakdown on the core tenets of the three theories, and specifically for the post-colonial theory, I also spell out how how it also was adopted, or how it came about through Edward Said's book. Then also scholars such as Young coming in to explain critical theory and its core proponents. But specifically for the study, I focused on applying it to understand the ongoing colonial legacies of archiving this heritage. Because even in the book, there's a point or a place where I state that ideally it's normal to think that after an armed struggle, after colonial occupation, even the archiving systems would change to incorporate more of the indigenous narratives, to incorporate more of the voices of Zimbabweans, which then the study findings show that for the Zimbabwean archive, this is different. Then the critical archival praxis specifically comes in to provide a critique of these processes, specifically when it comes to archiving liberation struggle heritage, with now the post-custodial theory, which also is one of the which is also under the post-colonial archival scholarship, coming in to interrogate issues of custody, ownership, and access to these armed struggle archives. So I've explained in the book, and because the presentation was mainly extracted from what I have in the book.
Okay, let me read for you just one short paragraph under 1.9.3 post-custodial theory. The research adopted the post-custodial theory to examine the complex nature of custodianship of armed struggle archives. Post-custodial theory falls within critical theory, which is liberatory in nature and aims at emancipation of the excluded groups in archival processes. Critical theory therefore provides the lens to interrogate the role of custodial and ownership in unequal power relationships involving archival documentation. One of the core tenets of post-custodial theory is to liberate archives from a focus on physical and legal custody, etc. The last sentence. Such an approach therefore opens the archives for more collaborative, community-oriented participation and engagements in the archiving process. Do I get to see who is the theorist behind this? That's the first paragraph of that theory. Do you get it?
Yes, thank you, Doctor. This has been well noted.
Who is the theorist behind that? So that is what I was saying, that you had clarity of theory in the presentation, but in the book, there are things that are not coming out. So perhaps that is something that you can take note of. Again, on the post-custodial theory, in page 37 in the second paragraph, you indicate that in 1981, Ham proposed the term post-custodial to respond to custodial transformations, etc. Then on page 38, you say, Ham's introduction of post-custodialism led to rethinking of total archives concept in Canada in 1960s. So you're talking about the introduction in 1981, and then it is influencing things in Canada in 1960. Is that something you can speak to?
Thank you, Doctor, for that. I think it was an issue of phrasing because we find that the total archives concept had been introduced earlier in the 1960s in Canada. But in 1981, when Ham then introduces the post-custodial theory, this therefore later on shapes our thinking towards archiving later on. So I think it's a matter of phrasing where I would have to rephrase so that I show that the total archives concept was adopted earlier. But later when Ham proposes this theory, now people and theorists and archivists change the ways of thinking around archiving and custody. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Something again on theory. If you look at page 153, I do like the way you deploy theory in your chapters. But page 153, you talk of Trilot's theorization of silence and how silencing happens in the process of archiving. Is that theory part of the things that you promised us in the theoretical framework? And you use it a lot to analyze things in chapter 4, 5, and 6. But it is not something that appears within the theories that you articulate at this point. Do you have any reason for that?
Thank you, Dr. Mwene. When we look at Trolot and his discussion around silences in historical production, it's actually a book where he traces different silences in the process of making history. So it was more of how he would interpret silences and describe these silences to say at every stage or at every moment of making history, different things are silenced in different ways. So in my interpretation of his analysis, I did not see it as really coming up to form a theory unless I stand guided. Again, I acknowledge that in this page, I talked about Trolot's theorization, but it's mainly meant to say, according to Trolot's interpretation of these silences in the process of historical production, he goes on to explain how different aspects are silenced in history. But in terms of the theories, I then looked at specifically those ones that influence my understanding and interpretation of different aspects of the study.
So amongst the other three then, who talks about silence, conceptualizes and gives guidance in terms of how you can identify and understand it in the archives? Because then for me, this is the person that defines, that gives parameters, that shows you how to identify whatever silences. So this body of work is not perceived as theory because of what? I wanted to ask on the Ugandan street, because why?
Thank you, Doctor. As I explained, he wrote a book merely narrating these silences. Then the way I understand a theory has to be conceptually tested and acknowledged that this is theory. But then maybe with consultation with my supervisors, I think it's something that we can go back to try and see how we incorporate that, whether it becomes part of theory or it just guides the analysis done in the research. Thank you.
Yes, you're not looking at it as theory, but you're repeatedly in chapter 4, 5, and 6 writing that the analysis is guided by Triod's theorization of silence. And then you go ahead and you actually use this work more than the other theories that you promised. So that is why I was asking, what is this? And I'm not saying it is inappropriate. You know, it is appropriate in articulating what is silence, how does it happen in the process of archiving, and you're using it, but you're not naming it as theory. So we might need to go back to looking at what is theory and how does a body of work become a theory. Yeah, let's proceed to, of course, as you promise, your supervisors, you will look through that and see how you can proceed. As you wind up that chapter, you indicate that the status of the archiving liberation struggle is marred by silences, and that the archival silences deprive historians and others important historiographical resources of the armed struggle. And that's how you end. And I was wondering, is that the most important thing you want us as your reader to remember about these interesting debates that you've had?
Thank you for that comment. Maybe if you could clarify which chapter you are referring to.
Chapter 1, as you're concluding it, you do indicate that these silences have an impact. They deny us of the important historiographical resources of the armed struggle. And I was wondering, is that all? Is that what you want us to know from that chapter?
Thank you, Doctor. From chapter 1, basically, I was laying the foundation for the study, laying the foundation for the research to bring out the core issues that are under study, to say, specifically focusing on this research, I interrogate this aspect of archival silences, which also impact on access to liberation struggle collections. So that was the key thrust in chapter 1, to try and lay the foundation such that as I move on now to the broader issues in the other chapters, I then explicitly define exactly what is happening in terms of archiving this liberation struggle heritage.
Okay. And then you cross to chapter 2 and look at the historical background to archiving liberation struggle heritage. And you begin from a discussion on the legacy of colonial archives at the National Archives of Zimbabwe, where you decry the epistemic violence in colonial archiving, indicating that documentation by the colonizers on the native African affairs was related to population statistics, criminal reports, etc., without reflecting real-life experiences of indigenous communities. You were so sad about that. And I was wondering, how different is your approach? How do you privilege indigenous forms of knowledge and experience in archiving the liberation struggle? Is it something that you reflect on?
Yes, thank you, Doctor, for that question. Yes, I largely reflect on that in this study, where in chapter 6, I explicitly look at the colonial archives at the National Archives of Zimbabwe, where in interviews, largely the archivists were stating that much of their collections have been written from the colonial perspectives, have been accumulated from the colonial era. So it's something that I largely reflect on, to say 44 years after independence, you would think that as an independent nation would actually put in more inclusive forms of archiving. Archive the marginalized voices, also, if possible, bring in the voices of these former nationalist movements. But unfortunately, because of the complex nature surrounding these archives of the former nationalist movements, they've also not been willing to deposit with the National Archives of Zimbabwe. That's where ultimately I then make recommendations for post-custodial approaches where whatever efforts are being done to salvage and archive these materials, it has to be done in the spaces of these former nationalist movements, wherever they are keeping these materials, because ultimately depositing with the National Archives of Zimbabwe has proved impossible. So I actually engage with that a lot because it's also something that comes in strongly in the study and pushes for this research to say, why is it we still have more of the colonial voices than our own indigenous voices in these archival spaces?
Yes. These nationalist movements, as you indicated, happened outside of Zimbabwe in the neighboring communities and later on into Zimbabwe, as you indicate. And I'm sure these movements had contact with communities and cultures. Is that something that you trace?
In this study, under my scope, I don't go that far to trace such aspects.
Okay, I'm looking at archival context. And I'm looking at the kind of context under which archives are produced.
Mm.
And we're looking at these nationalist movements and where they are happening, the communities where they are happening. Because, as you later indicate in your study, nobody set out to do archiving, to capture, record, and avail it. And, there's a voice that you pick on that people did not deliberately set out to archive stuff. But life happened and records were formed and people were interacting and in contact with these cultures. So I wanted to know whether that context mattered in the production of the archives that we're talking about.
Okay.
That culture, the idea that you're in touch with people and people's cultures, does that context inform the process of archiving?
Okay. Thank you so much, Doctor. Yes, that process actually informs the context of archiving because archiving is not done in a vacuum. Definitely, it's influenced by different processes, different events, the communities, and so forth. But specifically for the study, when I trace this archiving, I look at these materials that these former nationalist movements created while they were in exile. Then, because they'd already been created in exile under those war conditions, I then go on to trace these archives back into the country to say what then happens to these archives when they have been received back into the country. So for this study, also acknowledging the fact that in that war situation, when they were operating outside of the country, obviously the communities where they were operating in were also like sort of alien communities, which were not mainly Zimbabwean communities. So that's where also in my recommendations, I say maybe for future research, it could actually probe deeper into such contexts to say, since these people operated outside of the country, in those contexts, in those communities, maybe the communities can also come in to inform excuse me, certain practices around the archiving of this heritage. But because in my study, I actually look at what was brought inside the country after independence, I then focus on those archives that were repatriated back in terms of what has happened to them, what are the challenges that have been faced in trying to archive these materials.
Okay. And of course, the context include the idea that this was a war that also included a lot of secrecy. In some cases, secrecy as a tool, but also gross human rights violations, lots of bombing. You have resistance against colonial oppression. You have competing global dialogues from the foreign support, the Red China, communism, and all that. How does this context then produce the archive?
Okay. Thank you for that question. In chapter 5, I actually trace the nature of these war archives to appreciate when we speak of war archives, what do we mean? What comprises war archives? So I acknowledge the secrecy that surrounded the creation of these archives, whereby in interviews, respondents actually would acknowledge that they would have an intelligence department to really make sure that they have those intelligence records, and they would keep them in safe houses away from places where they could be raided anytime and have their plans exposed. So the secret nature of all archives is traced to acknowledge also the complexities that we later see in archiving this heritage, because the secret nature of the war, we see it being carried even post-independence into how these materials are kept after the war, where even now when we trace these materials to the different institutions where they are being kept, even the custodians are not willing for people to access them because they feel that the records still have those connotations of being highly secretive and being kept outside of the public. So even the associations that these former nationalist movements had, like you rightly say that for the ZANU, they were mainly associated with China, and they would receive funding there. For the ZIPRA, they were mainly associated with the Cubans and the Russians and so forth. So most of those things are captured in the archives, where I really try to trace that secret nature, interrogate it, and ultimately bring out how it affects the archiving of these materials. So I largely interact with that in my chapter 5.
Okay, so do you, in a way, do you think then, when an archive is produced in silence, seclusion, and all that, could that explain why we are struggling with the silences around the archive in Zimbabwe now?
Thank you, Doctor. I would say partially, because in this study, I also tried to compare with the archives of other former nationalist movements in Southern Africa. For instance, when we look at the archives of the African National Congress, the ANC, it has been largely documented by a lot of scholars, and these scholars have really traced how these archives were repatriated back into the country and ultimately sent to the University of Fort Hare, where they are accessible to the public. However, even when we look at what has been sent to that University of Fort Hare under the African National Congress, scholars such as Pickover and Stapleton would actually state that they first started by screening of certain materials. So the fact that these materials are produced in a war situation, at some point, not everything is ultimately accessible. But in a different way, with the African National Congress, at least they made efforts to send part of their collections to the University of Fort Hare, where researchers, historians, and scholars have been able to access these materials. And scholars have even stated that for the liberation struggle history of South Africa to be written, they had access to such archives. So when we trace and look at the Zimbabwean situation, as much as these materials were produced in secret war situations, captured all these sensitive materials, ultimately they've been closed off to the public and they are not accessible.
Okay, thank you. Let's move into methodology, research methodology. I just wanted to learn from you what kind of paradigm informs the way you did the research process. At some point you talked of objectivity and as the reason as to why you never reflected on your position. What paradigm are you working in?
Thank you, Doctor, for that question. For this study, I adopted an interpretivist paradigm to appreciate the archiving of this liberation struggle heritage from multiple perspectives, and appreciating the different realities that come in to complicate the archiving of this heritage.
Okay, thank you. So There are moments I have come across in your study where you seem to be so much focused on facts. If you look at chapter 4 and chapter 5, there's so much emphasis on fact, truth versus lies. So as an interpretivist researcher, what is your commitment? How do you conceptualize truth?
Thank you, Doctor, for that question. So actually how I approach the interpretation of the different issues that I look at in the study, in chapter 3, I acknowledge that I use triangulation where I bring in various methods to try to understand these issues from different perspectives. For instance, in chapter 4, when I trace the aspect of contestations, this heritage largely remains contested, but I try to bring in multiple interpretations. For instance, I talk about the incident of the Salisbury fuel tank bombings in Harare, where when you trace this event, it was largely documented in the newspapers, where I cite newspaper quotations about this event, what happened. But again, that event also gets disputed, where the ZAPU veterans will claim that they were responsible for these bombings. So I do not rely on one source as the ultimate objective truth, because approaching the study from an interpretivist perspective, I have to appreciate the multiple interpretations that can come in, whereby when I look at a source, whether it's documentary analysis, I have to also bring in other sources to corroborate. Also, I largely work with archival sources to explain certain issues. So largely, I don't rely on one source as a form of ultimate truth.
Yes, Heather, we're going to return to that in chapter 4 or 5, and I will particularly request you to make a comment on a statement. But for now, I was just reflecting on how comments or voices would come from participants, and you carry them on. They're telling you this is not the truth, the fact is this, and you carry all that along. I have also not met any intellectual commitment where you explicitly state that you are invested in understanding the multiple truth, and therefore people who are vested in looking at what is true and what is false will not be the line that you're towing. So we arrive at that, I think, in chapter 4 or 5, and I will request that you reflect on that. But it is something that I wanted, that it stems from the methodology in terms of whether you are taking an interpretivist and the implications of that. You talk about sampling procedure, and then this is how you write about it, page 79. You say the study sampled respondents likely to contribute most relevant data to the research. Then you go ahead to list participants that you talked to, and I was wondering what sense do you make of that? What sampling procedure did you use? Of course, I saw in the presentation you mentioned certain strategies.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Mwine, for that. Specifically, I adopted purposive sampling, though not explicitly stated in this paragraph. I make a footnote citing Creswell and other scholars who speak about purposive sampling. So I specifically adopted purposive sampling to identify people with the relevant information, experts in archiving, like the respondents or participants from the National Archives of Zimbabwe. So besides those ones with the most relevant information, I also engage and adopt snowball sampling, though not explicitly stated by it, but I actually explain that I would rely on referrals, because now when we look at sensitive topics as studying liberation struggle heritage, you'd find that not everyone is willing to talk about it. So I had to look for certain war veterans would then refer me to other people or other veterans who are more knowledgeable about the archives of the study, or about the archives of the struggle, not just the war, because the focus was on the archives. So I would have to be referred to those people with knowledge about the archives. So those are basically the procedures that I adopted under assembly.
It is okay. I think me and you are agreeing on what you're saying. You're not explicit. Why are you not explicit? To say purposive sampling and explain what it is, snowball sampling, you're saying you're not explicit. Is there any ethical principle that requires that? So that's my worry, that things are just popping up and you're not explicitly committing to these strategies. And I will read for you briefly that the request is really to be explicit. It's not that you do not know what purposive sampling is, but you're not explicitly stating these and writing them in as methodological choices that you have deliberately decided to work with. So 3.4 sampling procedures, you say the study sampled respondents likely to contribute most relevant data to research, the director, the chief archivist, the archivists, including former archivists at NAS, etc. So, and as you're completing the paragraph, you say other respondents were purposively selected. You get it? So I don't know what the first ones, how the first ones were selected, but what I know is that other respondents were purposively selected. And then you go to the next paragraph and indicate that the process that was followed to reach out to the war veterans was to initially identify one of the ZIPRA war veterans who fit the study's inclusion criteria. I haven't seen the criteria yet, but then you say the veteran then became the referral person, introducing the researcher to other informants, etc. So the explanation, the way you presented orally there, was clear, but those methodological choices are not as explicit as you are explaining. So perhaps you might need to reflect on that and how you address it. Then when you write about nationalist movements, page 90, you talk of how you interviewed veterans using Snowball. And this is just mentioned in passing and not justified. So it's really to request that you name the strategies you're working with and justify them as methodological choices. How did you conduct data analysis?
Thank you, Doctor, for the question. So my analysis was largely thematic, where I would first look at the data, organize it, then read through. Actually, for the interviews, I initially had to transcribe them. Then after transcribing, I would have to read through the interviews, pick or come up with key codes that then guided the key themes that we worked with in the analysis and interpretation of the data.
Okay, at some point in chapter 4, page 99, you talk of employing a historical analysis to examine various events and documents surrounding the liberation struggle. This is something that you do not reflect on in chapter 3. Is that an omission or it's a deliberate decision?
In chapter 3 is actually there when I speak about my design, because I explained that the study followed a historical case study design. So following the historical case study design, historical analysis was also engaged in the study. So I explained that under chapter 3, just before the section where I talk about the main data analysis.
How do you analyze the photographic archives, the newspaper cuttings, are they also through thematic?
For the newspaper cuttings, the photographs, I employed document analysis. Yeah, it was mainly through document analysis.
How does that work?
Document analysis, it was part of the methods that I used in the study. So for the archival materials, that's where I would analyze the material, also following the historic methods and trying to see whether those materials, do they help in answering the key research questions. But then for document analysis, so document analysis, the same way that would also treat interviews in data collection. So instead of speaking to people in document analysis, I would actually identify key documents.
Professor Farouk, is it us or the other side? Zimbabwe? Oh, okay. Black. Okay. We will be through.
Okay, so sorry, the connection was lost. So I was responding to document analysis to say, as part of my
That
hello?
you had responded to that, so
Yes.
I will request you to respond to the ethical principles that informed your study. What ethics did you, principles did you work with as a historical and archival study?
Thank you for that question. So largely, I worked with the ethical principle of informed consent. This was a very important principle in this research, given that I was looking at a sensitive topic on liberation struggle heritage, where most of the respondents would have to consent to participating. Then that consent also went into aspects of whether I would record or not record the respondents, where most of the respondents or some of the respondents would even make it clear cut from the word go that they would not want to be audio recorded. So this also tied together with the aspect of anonymity, where the respondents would not agree for their identities to be made public.
Yeah, and that's okay. Humanities, social sciences would work with those general principles of ethics. But as a historical study that is looking back in the past, what kind of ethics did you work with?
Okay, thank you for that question. Maybe if you could clarify more, I'm really not clear on that one.
Yeah, ethics that require, for instance, for you to read past experiences in their own context. Ethics that would require you to retrieve historical injustices, uncovering historical imbalances, and privileging marginalized voices. These are debates on ethics.
Yes.
And so I think beyond the general principles that you have stated, ethics around transformative and emancipatory aims of studies of this nature, they need to be written into a study of this. And of course, we've talked about your positionality already. In terms of contestations, when you look at the nature of the liberation struggle, you cite literature indicating that the definitive history of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle is yet to be written. That this is because most attempts have lacked objectivity, resulting in contested history of the liberation struggle. But also later, as you talk about establishment of Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology, your discussion reflects that the aim was really to teach the correct history. And that's the language I was pointing to when I was asking what kind of paradigm is informing your analysis. So you don't need to respond to this. But that is what I meant, that in some points you seem to be to let appeals to truth and as opposed to lies.
Thank you, Doctor. Please allow me to respond. Allow me to respond, especially where I cite the Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology, because that actually the statement came from one of the interviewees who was alluding to the fact that that institution has come to teach the correct history of the armed struggle. So it was actually an assertion that was made by one of the representatives of that particular institution. Not to say it was a fact or a factual statement being made by the researcher, but it was being captured from the perspective of that particular respondent, who is a representative of the Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology.
Yes, the only expectation from me was that then as a researcher you engage with that critically and say whether there is correct or incorrect and what that means. It's the only expectation I had. I know it came from the respondent. Within the understanding of the movements and the conflicts that they experienced, we look at the internal conflicts between these nationalist movements. And I wanted to ask how complex was the context that produced the liberation struggles and the records therefrom. But of course we have reflected on this, as in chapter 3 we talked about context. I was wondering whether you met ideas around class divisions, ethnicity, different global ideologies, white racial colonialism, and whether these are things that you reflect on in terms of how they intersect to produce a complex nature of the archive. Just 1 minute, because you had already reflected on some of them.
Thank you, Doctor, for that one. Actually, in chapter 4, when I trace the complexities, I just bring an appreciation of the relations between the two main nationalist movements and the differences in ideologies, differences in approaches to the armed struggle, even in the internal divisions, where some of the commanders would not be happy about how they are being led in the war, then there are clashes leading to a fallout and breakaway parties and so forth. So I trace those things in appreciation of how the contestations come about during the war, then post-independence, to trace how such contestations also shape the narratives then that we get about the armed struggle, this patriotic historical narrative that comes in to shape how we memorialize, how do we remember, what do we remember about the armed struggle and what is not remembered. So I did not go deeply into unpacking the ethnicities, the white racialism and all those things. It was just to appreciate that history, then immediately link it with the complexities then that follow when we want to understand the archiving of this heritage.
Okay. Let's move to the gender question. There are other liberation struggles where the question of gender was significant. How does your dissertation engage with this question?
Thank you, Doctor, for that question. So in terms of gender, most of my participants were male and not women, mainly because the women who participated in the armed struggle, those ones that I managed to have contact with, yes, they had stories about the war, but not specifically when it came to archiving this heritage. So in this study, I was dealing with like two issues where as much as the history of the war would come in, but also the main focus was on then archiving this heritage. What are the issues around archiving the heritage? So on the gender issues, I'm not also explicit about the participation of women in this research because it was not mainly about merely talking about the war to say, okay, in this war, women had these roles and they participated in this way, men also participated in that way. But the core issue was to look at the documents, the archives. That was where the focus of the study mainly was.
Yeah, but you could tell us whether the archives really capture and represent narratives around gendered experiences. Because on page 116, you actually share a photo of VP Mujuru who stole my picture, which I thought would have been an interesting entry point to discussing that question. So it is something that you need to think about. The story, Salisbury, fuel tank bombings, and some of the other stories. It's not a question, it's a feeling from the reader. As I read through, I felt some of the events were analyzed without enough description to enable somebody who is reading for the first time to appreciate what they are. And what I pointed out is that Salisbury fuel tank bombings, I had to read until the last point to know what exactly was this about and why is it featured as a key point of contention. You discuss in chapter 5, 5.2, creation of war archives, as we discuss creation and concealment of reality. One reality that is apparent is the secretive nature of the liberation struggle, and we are told the Zimbabwe liberation struggle was highly secretive, created at, and then you add that whether the archives were created at large scale or small scale, in secrecy or in open, interviewees shared that during the war, respective liberation armies created a plethora of records, and I was thinking that this statement reads as though context does not matter in the way the archives are produced. But you have explained that archives, contexts do matter. And these are points where you can return and then re-emphasize in your dissertation that actually context does matter. The other one? The other is really the way you presented and reflected on archives. I got a feeling that archives then, as you engaged with them, are products of power. In as much as archivists make deliberate choices, but also archives as stages upon which political power is contested. Is that something you feature in your work?
Thank you, Doctor. Maybe if you could explain in terms of what you mean by that statement.
Archives as products of power, but also archives as stages upon which power is performed. The way you contest between the nationalist movements. And it's not a question to really return to, but it is to look at how your work is spanning out. Is that something that you're building towards?
Okay. Thank you for that, Doctor. Yes, in the work I actually have a quotation where I say that archives are politics, archives are political